People in. But look, thank you so much for coming along today to join our webinar, Formation Tech webinar of Cybersecurity, Mind the Gap. We run a lot of these webinars, and it's fair to say that we had a lot of interest both from customers and prospective clients for today, which I'll come on to moment. But from Fortinet with us today, we have Stephen Jameson, who's a Senior Solutions Engineer. Thank you for joining, Stephen.
Good morning, thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Not a problem at all. And we have our very own Mike Scott, who's our Head of Technology. Thanks as well to yourself, Mike.
Always good to be here.
Excellent. Well, I was mentioning moments ago, we do run a lot of these webinars, and there has been a real interest. And I think that the thing we're seeing with our customers in the market is that, the last couple of years, a lot of people have had to deal with a lot of change in IT, from moving to the cloud, into SaaS applications. And as that's happened with this significant change in the way people are working, there's been a sort of piecemeal approach to security, and new threats have come around. And I think that a lot of that heavy lifting has now been done with moving businesses to that way of working. But it's about taking a more holistic approach to security and how you can deal with it. And I think at the root of this is really that, what is the way businesses are approaching cybersecurity in a holistic way. And I think, our first topic is addressing the security gaps. There are 5 challenges we outlined we're going to be covering today. The first being addressing gaps, overcoming VPN issues, performance issues, managing shadow IT, simplifying operational complexity, and reducing vendor sprawl. They're all intertwined, and I'm sure we'll cover those topics with each topic we cover. But I think really, firstly, Stephen, to you, and around the security gap. And there's a question which was posed: what do we address first? And well, the common answer to that is, where the greatest impact would be felt should there be a breach. But more broadly, the gaps can be thought of in 2 ways. There's the actual gaps and oversights, but equally problematic are the multitude of gaps that occur because of the piecemeal approach to which security has been approached in these sort of previous years. So, summarization of that, Stephen. Where would you start on that topic?
Yeah, I think I suppose the summary points really are trying to deliver security, and consistent security in particular, for the workforce that you have today. With most organisations offering a hybrid workforce. So it's making sure people are as secure when they are remote as they are when they're in the office. But in doing that, is trying to make sure that you're not making the IT security significantly more complex by doing it, as you mentioned there, Mark, with individual tools to solve individual problems. Yes, that's an approach for doing it, but then what that then leads to is an increase in complexity. So I suppose I think the 2 main drivers that we're certainly seeing at Fortinet for IT budgets and IT security budgets in particular is people looking to have that consistent security to reduce those gaps, but also consolidating the number of touch points that they have to help them reduce the complexity.
Fantastic. I saw a little piece of housekeeping I should have covered at the beginning there. Please do message any questions you have in for us. Make it interactive as possible. Should be the points we raise that are of interest, we can either answer them during the session or afterwards. But to that point, I mean, this spans everywhere from the device to the cloud to the office. Stephen, perhaps on that sort of context, what are the kind of key things that you're seeing as challenges for people out there right now?
Yeah, it is being able to. I suppose if you take a step back and look at why have we ended up with such a been commonplace to have a hybrid workforce. That probably started around 4 years ago with the pandemic, where people, certainly organisations that had no remote working or very limited, suddenly had to enable their entire workforce to be able to work remotely, but equally work securely. So I think that was the starting point, and I think the first thing that people tried to overcome was making sure they could get connectivity to the applications that they needed. But if you now look at the environment today, we've moved away from a network-centric security model and where applications are to they could still be in your own data center. They could be in the public cloud, but equally they could be a SaaS application. So you've got multiple locations where applications are. You've got multiple locations where the users accessing those applications are, and being able to give them the access first of all, but making sure it's secure. That really leads to the challenge.
Yeah, and I think if you take simple things like vulnerability scanning, the people might go, I need to do that as a gap I've got, but there also maybe skill gaps where someone has an Azure-based workload, for example, that has a completely different security structure to the way in which they manage something else. Do you want to perhaps touch on that before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, and I think that is a very good example. It is, you've put something into the public cloud. They have their native tools. So the easy thing, I suppose, to do, and I say easy in inverted commas, is to use the native tools. But why have a different set of security tools when you've already likely to have a firewall in place? You can extend that security by either extending the firewall policies or by rolling out a virtual firewall in your public cloud environment, but still managing it from the same location from your centralized management. So you've got that consistency of policy and consistency of touch points.
Yeah, and from a skill perspective, you've got less skills. You need less tacit knowledge about certain technologies, and you can manage it all centrally through a single kind of portal or single policy deployment.
Yeah, I always call those as like head scratching moments. I know how to do it on that portal. It's going to be slightly different if I'm doing it on that one over there. So it's trying to reduce that and ultimately save people time.
So thanks, Tim. The next sort of topic, which sort of is intertwined with this really, is VPN performance. And I think people think about VPN performance predominantly as like my VPN doesn't perform, as in it's got dropouts, it's unstable, it's unproductive. But I think that there's a lot more to the performance of VPN, certainly from a security perspective, and they are again interlinked. And I think perhaps to you, Mike, if we're looking at the evolution of VPN and how that is improving and impacting the way in which performance, both from a security and user perspective, sits. Perhaps over to you on some summarization around that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth sort of just going back to why VPN is so prevalent in the market and why it's being used. And it's not being used for the wrong reasons; it's been used for the right reasons. But there are challenges associated with it. And when Stephen sort of laid this out, what people have done is like the workforce has become more hybrid. How do we secure their applications and their traffic? Oh, that's okay. We'll just VPN them back to the office/data center, and we'll kind of secure it from our point products, because we got web filtering in the office, we got antivirus and next generation firewalls. We'll just backhaul it back to there. So, but to one of your points about that VPN performance, yes, there is, that architecture of doing that has its challenges. So do you have enough bandwidth? Does your next generation firewall have enough grunt to do that? So the impact of that is your user experience will drop. So that's one sort of, let's call that physical performance. But there are additional challenges, right? VPN is a single point of authentication. Once you're on, and you stay on, and you're completely authenticated for the duration that tunnel stays up. Now, this presents some more complex challenges because the status quo doesn't always work, and plus, if that username and password is compromised, then there's a backdoor into your potentially your entire network and your data and your infrastructure, which is a dangerous point. And that's why we sort of look to some technologies, zero trust being the most prevalent in that. Just to be clear, zero trust still applies to VPNs. So in the background, there's still VPN technologies going on there. But what it gives us to use the ZTNA or zero trust network access is, rather than going, right, we'll point you at a data center and we'll authenticate once and then you're on, we'll actually go, we'll point you at a data center, but the user doesn't have to make that decision. That happens automatically. So one, user experience it improves. Two, we're validating not just you as a user, B, that you've got a password, but also C, what kind of device are you using? Is it corporate owned and corporate managed? What's the status of that device? So what's your posture? Do you have antivirus? Is your firewall enabled? Are you part of the right security groups to access the data? And based on all of that information, we can control, not just at a point, but continuously, and evaluate you during your sessions. And those sessions will come up and down automatically, and at each point will be re-evaluated. There's that sense of continuous evaluation, something we don't get with traditional VPN. So your granularity of control is far superior in that setup.
Yeah, and talking more broadly, you touched upon zero trust as a concept, and really what you talked about is posture and how that works. And I think it's a really useful and interesting concept to understand. And you talked about, again, the concepts of zero trust network access, and there are so many acronyms. It's going to get worse as we get through it. I would try and keep them as layperson as we can. But yeah, that broader sense of zero trust, it plays into other applications as well within this. So it's negating the need for VPN for some ways of working. A lot of stuff's in SaaS now, as in software as a service type platform. So perhaps in that context, Mike, how would you?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's like my earlier point, and just to reiterate on zero trust, because I think that's a good point you made. We didn't describe what that is. It's not technology, it's a concept, right? The concept is never trust, always verify. Okay, so that is a concept that overarching of all your technology should comply with each of those things. So you're always re-authenticating, you're always evaluating, but obviously not at the expense of the user experience. But the great thing is the tools exist there to make that great and experience great. So
there's a couple of questions here, Mike, actually, before we jump into that. So I think you probably answer these questions possibly together. How much impact does this have on the user from a resource and bandwidth point of view compared with the traditional VPN? And the second one is, how do VPNs ZTA tap into conditional access? So can you answer that in one thread, or are those two separate questions?
They're slightly two separate questions. From a user experience and what the user sees, when you set up a well set up zero trust network access tool, it's session based rather than tunnel based. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to get to XYZ resource or application, and the user's not going, in order to do that, I need to fire up my VPN to the office or to the data center or to the Shanghai data center, for example. That decision making is being done by the user. In terms of bandwidth, it's exactly the same, but from a kind of friction from a user perspective, that evaporates, right? They're just accessing it. Also, it's aware of where you are as a user. Are you on net or on Fabric? Are you on the corporate network? Or are you off that? Are you somewhere else? So that forms part of your posture. So we can restrict access to certain things if you're not on a secure network, for example. So that's an important point. Conditional access is part of zero trust. So most of the conditional access policies can be grouped under a zero trust. So there is continuous evaluation. It's part of the tool. It's not necessarily plugging directly into whatever zero trust network access tool, but it forms part of that. So your identity and conditional access and your zero trust networking provide you that overlay for zero trust. So they're complementary is probably the way to describe it.
Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful. Please do find more questions in if that's stimulating any further questions. Thank you. No problem at all. It leads quite nicely onto the third topic we have, actually, which is around shadow IT. And this is not a new problem. Businesses have been, users have gone to the sort of least friction to work in the way in which they want to work based on applications they may use in the consumer world. Dropbox is often a well-cited example, but certainly the proliferation of remote working, it's definitely something that is very much more on the radar. And I think that these users have as much access often to corporate data as controlled applications, but have very little sight. So the components we just talked about there, Mike, are relevant. But Stephen, to yourself, in the context of shadow IT and that further kind of security fabric, where would you start on that? Or where would you continue from that point, would you say?
Yeah, I suppose where I'd start is really, I suppose, the sort of more granular definition of shadow IT. It's not necessarily an external threat. It can be internal and it can be external, but it's really, I suppose, the shadow IT to me is people that are doing things that are outside of the either acceptable use or company policy use case for IT resource. And that's down to an individual person. So controlling who has access, what applications are they allowed access to, and when, and where are they from. So it's really been able to have the ability to get the visibility and control to enforce the prevention of people doing things they're not allowed to be doing, basically.
And avoiding or explaining acronyms, what are the technologies we're talking about here that are going to be addressing these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination, I suppose. It's not a single solution. So you would have things, for example, like CASB, so Cloud Access Security Broker. You could have a web proxy. You could have a secure internet gateway, you could have a firewall and ZTNA. So it's a number of different technologies that you would need to be able to truly, really deliver the. I suppose the expression that we use is contextual experience for a user. So you're moving away from an employee. Like you're an employee, you get access to this, to more of a user-centric approach to the access and to the security policy, but you need those multiple tools to be able to do it.
Yeah, and stepping away from the sort of industry terms that are in our day-to-day language, so CASB, Secure Web Access Gateway, ZTNA, they're just language that becomes really familiar if you're in this world every day. If you were to just break those out and just say that in sort of layman terms, from a user or business perspective, like what are they doing for people? Why are they using it? And are we also talking about, just to chuck one of that, another final acronym in here is the broader term of SASE, which is talked about a lot. Interesting, you look at the sort of hype curve in Gartner. And the reason I think today has been so interesting for people is that, or at least a number of people who have come along to hear what we have to talk about today, is that there's a real adoption stage with this sort of thing, which it has historically been, well, this looks really interesting, whereas now people are really looking at it. But going back to that initial question, what are the use cases for these in sort of layman's terms?
So, yeah, if you pull those different technologies that I mentioned together and say, what are they trying to solve? And then really it is, to me, it's three things. It's secure internet access, secure access to your private data center, so your corporate data center, and then secure access to SaaS applications. So being able to do all of those things, in doing it simply, that's led to the adoption of things like SASE.
The first topic is actually simplifying operational complexity, which ties quite nicely. We have a question here as well, though, from someone, which is it's somewhat off topic, but as many resources as possible via SSO become more commonplace, but how do you balance the ease of use and management benefits against the single point of failure concerns? Which one of you would like to take that question?
Shall I take that one? Yeah, so that's a really good question. Very much so. I think having a single source of identity for single sign-on is a positive. Now, I appreciate the sort of the undertone to the question was like, I've got one identity. So if one identity is exploited, then I might have a challenge in that. But I'd probably tie this back into your conditional access as well. And with all identity, single sign-on is fantastic. But if you're not using multi-factor authentication or biometrics or similar as part of this, then you're going to run into trouble. So there's two things. If you're using single sign-on, right, initially you might think, oh, that's a point of weakness. But actually, if you've got one user account, you've got one thing to shut off in the event of a breach. Okay, so if you've got several user accounts, you go, well, which one do I need to switch off? Right, okay, so it is solving things. Is it solving everything? No, but it's part of the security journey, and simplicity is always best for security. Complexity is the enemy of security. If you've got highly complex systems, you're going to have misconfigurations, you're going to create holes, and no one's going to be maintaining each of the individual components. But if you can bring that all into single platforms, we're not saying one platform to rule them all, right? That doesn't exist, right? But as fewer platforms as possible, covering as many bases as possible, is really the direction of travel, what we're seeing. But identity is a key part of ZTNA. Yeah, it's absolutely key. But obviously, all of the other security mechanisms, your multi-factor, all of those sorts of things need to be governed. It's not solved by one technology, but it is an important piece.
Fantastic. I hope that answers the question. Please, again, do ask more if more context needed. And so it does lead nicely on to the next point around simplifying operational complexity. Look, Fortinet's the reason we've got Fortinet on today. They are obviously a strong partner of ours, but a big part of what they do is that simplification, bringing things together. I don't think Fortinet set themselves out to be all things to all people, but certainly very much the topic of today, Mind the Gap, is the points I made at the head of the webinar, which is the gaps may be the fact you have a multitude of things doing competing jobs, overlapping jobs that require lots of complexity. But perhaps we can go into that bit, into a bit deeper, Stephen. Fortinet's position on this, having single vendor approach to a number of these areas, perhaps on an operational level, should perhaps touch upon that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I think that has been our approach. It's been our approach for a number of years. Might just mention the platform approach, which is really, a front and center of how we believe that security should be delivered. Internally we call it our Fortinet fabric, but ultimately what it is we've pulled together the technologies that we've developed to been able to interact with each other, share information, and then been able to automate a response to threats, for example. And as the threats evolve and as gaps emerge into, I suppose, working practices and how organizations are accessing information on a daily basis, that needs to evolve as well. But I suppose the main thrust for us, and I suppose for that platform approach, is to reduce the number of management points as much as possible, so you're getting that single source of truth. But ultimately, for us, it's also a single operating system. So you're not, people could put a badge on it and say it's called Fortinet, but unless it talks to the other Fortinet products, it's not really really solving anything if it's got different software. So our approach is consistency within the platform, in developing things within house, so that we are able to offer something that is simplified your day-to-day operations. And even as new things come along, like the challenges we're just talking about, don't change our approach. It's just evolve what you're already doing, so you've still got that single platform approach to delivering the security.
Mike, on the ground, sort of from a customer perspective, where are you seeing the quick wins? Obviously, in all technology we talk with in the various areas we work with as a business, consolidating vendors is key for obvious reasons, for control, for management. But from this perspective, what are the foundational bits? What are the quick wins? What is the sort of aspirational state in your mind?
Back to our kind of naming of this webinar, Mind the Gap. It's not just the security gap we're talking about here, is it? It's the skills gap, okay? Because every time you purchase another product to patch a security hole that's a new threat vector for bad actors to exploit, it's another set of training. And does all of your staff know how to support that particular product, or just one person? Has that person just left the organization and you're left with this patchwork? So operationally, skills gaps exist. Having this platform approach with common user interface, it's very familiar, it's very easy to manage. Every bit of it is talking to the other bit of it, rather than having this disparate systems which are not talking to each other. That provides that kind of operational overhead reduction in terms of managing your security, and it's just easier to manage from that perspective.
And Stephen, back to the point around, a lot of the sort of root kind of I guess history of this is this change to remote working, the removal of the perimeter firewall. Everyone used to come into the office 9 to 5. It was very clear what was secure, what wasn't. What are the kind of quick wins for people from where they're starting? So if they're talking about, when you're looking at businesses, it's hard to know where to start sometimes. Obviously, that's our job to help those businesses understand that. But in the market, what are the things that you're seeing really getting adopted right now that have either been out there for a little while, or just now people really kind of resonating and meaningfully solving those operational and security issues?
Yeah, I think it is. I suppose the very first thing I mentioned, we are definitely seeing a lot of, which is trying to reduce the number of vendors that they have. I think on average, people have between 25 and 30 different vendors to deliver security across their whole infrastructure. So definitely seeing an element of that. Going into, I suppose, the individual components of that. If we were having this conversation 3 years ago, certainly people were looking at how can we adopt a zero trust network access rather than doing VPNs. Today, virtually all of those conversations are around SASE. So that is, going up, you mentioned the Gartner hype curve, is very much that's what, individual organizations are looking at this now. Again, because they've got that hybrid workforce and making sure that they're addressing it. And that could be for a number of reasons. It can be for security, it could be for compliance, and it could be just to make the user experience better. But I say that the majority of conversations that we have, even when we start off talking about firewalls or switching or anything else, does lead back into a SASE conversation as well.
And obviously, there's an assumed knowledge here that SASE is a well understood concept, and it takes a little while. But how pure is the definition of SASE? How far do you have to go into it to say, well, this is what I'm doing? Because it is a combination of things, isn't it? And it may be, it's not all things, and some businesses may not have the same challenges, or they may have catered to elsewhere. What in your view is actually the spectrum of deployment for that sort of conceptual technology?
Yeah, actually, it's a very good point, because a lot of the conversation we've had, and a lot of the, I suppose, the market that you see around SASE talks about the security elements of it. And there is multiple parts to that. You've got a firewall element, you've got a ZTNA element, you've got the other technologies that we mentioned. But first and foremost, you've also got the secure access, so that it's an element of SD-WAN. And you can't really have, the simplicity that you desire when you're looking at technology like SASE without having that SD-WAN element built into it. That needs to be as much part of the solution as the security elements of it.
And SD-WAN, we've done whole webinars on SD-WAN, which, by the way, we have on our website, I believe, or at least we happen to share. So it's not a topic for today, but another acronym to bring in at the end. And I think, it's another one which I think has a whole spectrum of applications, which then we as a business we see commonly there's a standard 90% of the features that are used, which is what we would call SD-WAN. Other people have different definitions of it. We're coming up to the sort of tail end of the webinar. I've got a couple of minutes left, and I always like to finish these things. So, Steve, I might get you to summarise in a moment kind of the points we've covered. I think we've been around the points, and they are all rather intertwined. But I think to Mike, we've talked about a lot of the things that are relevant now. If we were talking 2 years ago about what today would look like, obviously, if we're looking at, say, the Gartner curves of hype cycles and adoptions and stuff, it's really quite aligned with what's actually happening. So fast forward into the next year or two, what things are you seeing, or what thing would you want to add in at the end of this webinar to say, hey, this is interesting, keep an eye on this, and it might be of use?
Yeah, absolutely. That hype cycle's got sort of maybe 20 or 30 kind of things to be excited about in the next 2 to 5 years, and not all of them make it to see the light of day after the initial excitement of what the technology can do, because the reality maybe not lives up to the expectation. But I think probably the one that I'm most kind of excited or interested about is the concept of digital experience monitoring. That sounds quite nebulous, but ultimately it does a number of things, and it is part of the FortiSASE solution. It can be bought separately. You don't have to have SASE to have it, so you can achieve it without this, but they essentially are going to be including it in the solution. Now, what it is a number of things. It's really just checking health of your infrastructure and your networking, but also it can go down to device level. So is the device, CPU, memory, RAM, latency, packet loss, jitter, all those sorts of things. But also it adds things like application performance. So, and it's synthetic. So it's synthetically testing your applications, and it's telling you, right, we have an issue here. It's not an accurate issue. It's a problem with your HTTP responses from this particular application. So that can be monitored, alerted, you can identify security risks, all sorts of things. And this is kind of this visibility and how well is everything performing, because rather than having to look into 10 different locations, you've got one kind of dashboard to kind of manage that experience. So it's not just about the user experience, but that's obviously key to it, but it's like, what's the digital experience across your infrastructure?
Fantastic. We have a question here, which is possibly not one to answer in fact, we're at time here, but please do stay on. We can obviously continue as long as relevant. But how do we address these with multiple sites, 7 locations, lots of vendors, tricky where to start? Well, that is a very broad question. I mean, before I hand over to you to summarise, Mike, where would you start with that?
I think that just go into our discovery/consultancy phase. We'll come in, find out what the problems are, what are the biggest challenges. We can then do multiple things. We can either come in there and kind of work out what you've got. If you don't know, genuinely, we can help people with that, or you can say, well, here are our biggest challenges, and then we can bring in the guys to help solve that. So lots of different things. And then moving forwards, if it's an acquisitive company, it's just like, how do we, we bought another company, what's the template to setting that up? And we'd do that for a lot of organizations, because it's quite commonplace right now that happens. So we're helping people with those sorts of situations.
But please do reach out to your account manager around that, or whoever you're dealing with in the organization. Fairly big topic area, and we're very happy to help. Stephen, thank you so much for joining today. Equally, Mike. But Stephen, just to sort of finish off the webinar today, how do you summarise the points and close it off for today?
Yeah, I suppose the summary is, it's here and now, and it does affect virtually every organisation that you're likely to deal with, and so to deliver, what companies are expecting and how they're securing their infrastructure and their users and their applications and their data. You need to sort of look at this approach. And I thought I'd just bring out one of my customers. I've asked him, what is the biggest benefit of moving to this type of model? So his answer was, it's consistency, having same security protocols and procedures in place, so wherever in the world my users are, our infrastructure, applications, and endpoints are all protected, regardless of how they are connected. And I think, that to me is, that's exactly what we're trying to address with these types of solutions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, and thank you also everyone for spending half an hour of their morning with us. I hope it's been useful. And look, we run these webinars regularly in a number of topics, but please do reach out. Your account manager will also reach out to you to see how we might help you. But yeah, really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.